there is a legal interpretative tool, constitutional interpretative tool, or legal doctrine known as speed and substance. And what does speed and substance ask? So when you encounter some sort of law, the first question that you ask, what's the purpose of the law? What is objective? What is its intention? So today my objective is that once you walk out of this room, you all know what democratic decay is. And to accomplish that, I'm gonna contrast the concept framework of democratic decay with that one of constitutional retrogression. And yeah, I'm gonna do that. And finally, briefly, we're gonna discuss a little bit about the applicability of these two concepts, frameworks, terms. So, the first section of this article is about the decline of democracy worldwide. There is an understanding in academia that democracy is experiencing a setback, or what American leading scholar Larry Diamond from Stanford University, by the way, in the field of democratic studies, calls a democratic recession. Democracies are not bulletproof, but rather fragile. She knows. America. Don't remember?
You're not just supposed to be diplomatic, representative,
So, this picture personifies the vulnerability that even long-lasting democracies, long-lasting and rich constitutional history can fall prey to once you have this disease of populism spread like a cancer in your society. If once upon a time the biggest threat, the biggest concern of the scholar was about the quick death of democracy by means of a coup d'etat, today, academic considerations like the one in this article tackle the slow death of democracy. So often through the actions of democratically elected government. It's in this scenario that many scholars are trying to describe or conceptualize this democratic setback. As a consequence, a surplus of terminology has emerged, legal scientists. It is in this context that Tom Daly appears offering a new analytical framework that he has baptized democratic decay. So what is democratic decay? What is it? It's the incremental degradation of the structures and substance of liberal constitutional democracy. But that's a mouthful, isn't it? That's truly a mouthful. If you say that to somebody in the street, they don't understand a word of it. So this is a mouthful, let's bring it down, let's deconstruct it. Incremental, why incremental? Because you don't see the times from one day to the other just rolling down the street. It's a gradual process in which there is a degradation of the democratic form. Liberal constitutional democracy, why such a long name? Because Tom Daly claims to have a deep notion of what democracy means, in the sense that democracy is not just elections and procedures. All right? Democracy is more than that. So that's why the long name. He wants to give it a bigger notion, therefore, the three-dimensional long name. And why structures and substances? Because the degradation happens at two levels, on the structural level and on a substantial level. Now, you may ask, what does that mean, structure, substance? When we say a structure, we look at the accountability of institutions that keep government in check, at representing organs like parliament, at the enhancing of the executive power, which is what Professor was just talking about, that is happening in places like Hungary and Poland. But the problem is that not all problems can be tackled by looking uniquely at the structure. And that's where some substance comes in. Substance has more to do with looking at the sociological and cultural underpinnings of a society, its unwritten norms and conventions, behaviors like the attacks on the press, or lack of civility, something that we see often happening in Italy, but I'm not going to comment about politics. This distinction between structure and substance is key, as you will see later on, in distinguishing democratic decay from constitutional retrogression. The only issue, this term, is that as part 2 is titled, there is already an existing framework for understanding democratic decay. I mean, there is a lot of terminology out there, a lot, and I'm not sure if this is good. Hagen Ginsburg from Chicago University, I love Chicago. If there is anyone from Chicago, I love Chicago, have provided 2 different types of democratic backsliding. One, authoritarian reversion, which is a collapse into authoritarianism. We're not going to talk about this one today. And the second one, which is my focus, constitutional retrogression, which is a process of incremental decay, sounds familiar, right? In 3 basic pillars of democracy: competitive elections, right to speech and association, and the rule of law. Now, for Hart and Ginsburg, democratic, you see, I'm already mixing, constitutional retrogression is a bigger threat to democracy than authoritarian reversion. But in order for you to know let's see what is this constitutional retrogression. How does it unfold? It starts, and she has been talking about it the whole morning, with constitutional amendments, with the elimination of constitutional checks, with the centralization and politicization of the executive power, with the construction of a shared public sphere, and finally, with the elimination of political competition. Now, the constitutional retrogression framework is useful. The author starts, I'm not going to criticize afterwards. It's useful for a range of reasons. First, because it focuses on the trajectory of democratic erosion. It explains why illiberal governments, like the one she was talking about, tend to like it, because it's not on your face. It's not there. It comes in your face. It provokes less resistance on the public, which tends to be really ignorant of what you guys all know about, this, for the lawyers in the room who have studied the law. And third, and I find this really cool, it pinpoints that this type of manipulation is harder to spot. And Hagen Ginsburg used the analogy of the frog in boiling water, that it doesn't know how hot the water is until it's too late. And probably that's what is happening in many places. So that's the competitive framework. I wouldn't use the word competitive, but it's the somehow similar framework to democratic decay. Are you guys here? Yeah? All right. So let's compare them both. That's the third part of this article, this academic article. And the comparison between democratic decay and constitutional retrogression. What are the similarities? They have the same starting point. All right? Democracy is at risk, and we must measure this. We must assess how this is happening. We must measure this. Both approaches have a thicker notion of democracy, but what is the criticism coming from Daly? Daly argues that democratic decay may be a more appropriate term since it concerns the whole system rather than just the constitutional system. That's quite ambitious. Structure the whole system. So many variables, so many clusters within an area. But he claims that is a better approach because you capture the whole system. He argues that the term retrogression may be misleading. To the Hungary, retrogression to what? To totalitarianism? Is that any effect? To communism? Is anybody here from a communist country? From North Korea? Anybody? No. We have things up. So what are the main differences? Okay, a central difference is that democratic decay, and this is cool, democratic decay focuses on young and long-established democracies. Remember this. It focuses, Larry Diamond, in democratic, when he talks about democratic recession, has 4 categories. The last 2 are young democracies, like Italy's democratic system, and old established democracies, like America, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Another key difference is that the democratic constitutional retrogression approach doesn't look at corruption. So it's not, they don't consider this variable. So when analyzing countries like Venezuela, South Africa, where is Angela, or Brazil, because they don't look at the corruption, the author claims that you cannot have a broader picture. And finally, their methodology, and this is key. Constitutional retrogression takes a quantitative approach, while a democratic decay takes a qualitative approach. And this is what's gonna divide you guys. Because there are those of you, like me, who like structure, we like numbers and stats, and we like facts, and we like to be objective. And there are those of you who look at all those things. I'm sorry, that was biased. That was extremely biased. In conclusion, constitutional retrogression seems to have a legalist bias. It focuses on a structure, which is something that lawyers tend to do. She does it all the time. And it uses a quantitative approach without paying much attention to some variables that are more complex to the whole picture. Democratic decay claims to be specific and narrow, when it's opinion, by the way, because it only looks at young and long-lasting democracy. It also claims that this qualitative approach brings more depth. But perhaps two ambitions trying to map too many variables that are extremely hard to measure, thus risking bringing less clarity to an already convoluted field. Yet, the author, according to the author, it's not in this reading, but of course, I did my research. According to the author, saying substance has much of an impact as a structure, focusing on both, offers a more spread out view of threats to democratic rule. Now, let's talk about applicability. Let's talk about the practice of it. I'm Cuban, I self-identify as Cuban Canadian. So I spent first half of my life in Cuba, the second half of my life in Canada. So, let's apply the approaches to Cuba. No. Cannot be done. Democracy is a prerequisite. And if any of you who argues that Cuba is not a totalitarian system, but it's a one-party system, that is not an authoritarian system, that is not a military dictatorship, that is not a mafia state. If there is any one of you who argues that Cuba, there is some sort of participatory democracy in Cuba, please go outside with the first year students and you can sell the communist newspaper outside for €2. For €2. €2. And wear those really cool Pumas. So, but no, okay, I'm depressed. Cuba, no, you cannot apply the model there. Let's look at Canada now. Canada. The constitutional retrogression. You cannot get that. It's really hard to prove. Number one, because our constitution, which goes back to 1867, is becoming only stronger. We have a long and rich constitutional history in Canada. The most respected institution in our country is the Supreme Court, year after year, poll after poll, which, by the way, is not a bunch of all white men. There's some all white women as well. And third, and some of the greatest legal minds in the past 30 years have been women. McLaughlin is one of those. Chief McLaughlin was amazing. So, yes. Yes, we do. Yes, French-speaking woman. Yes, from Quebec. You're right. You're right. So, yeah, should it be more diverse? Our Senate is pretty diverse, but I'm not going to talk about Canada now. Anyway, it's hard to say that there's any sort of constitutional retrogression happening in Canada. So let's talk about democratic decay. Because you see, now it's more tricky. Is there democratic decay happening in Canada? And I'm sorry to the Brazilians and to the Colombians in the room and to the Mexicans in the room, and Americans as well. But But Canada, it is the strongest democracy in the Western Hemisphere. If we start measuring, by far. Especially after what happened in the United States, I'm sorry. But it is true. We have a better welfare system than our beautiful cousins, neighbors in the South. We do. We're not so different from them, by the way. We're allies. But yeah, constitutional democratic decay. Is that happening in Canada? Is there corruption in Canada? Yes, there is corruption. Indeed, there is corruption in Canada. As in any place where there is a human being. But is this evidence enough to prove that it's democratic, it's happening in Canadian society? No, it's not sufficient. And then if you start looking at our variables, it doesn't work for me. Neither of those, but neither of those two concepts applies to the Cuban case and the Canadian case. But these are extreme cases. Totalitarian system over here, and over here, well, Canada is a bubble. The world is not like Canada. What hemisphere in America?
These are two extremes.
Yes. Yes, I contend that, and I can argue that anywhere, anytime. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I sound too nationalistic. This is factual. We can measure this. All right, so all I want you to do, if you're not from Cuba, and if there is a Canadian in the room, please. No, that's kind of sad. You're from Brazil. You're from France, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine. See which frameworks works better for your specific case, for your specific context. In my case, none of them work